But if a curtailment limit's going to come in at 40% compared to a normal curtailment report assessment that's 20% or something, well, is that enough of a comfort for a developer to actually, or an investor to actually put money into that project? So I think that's the big thing. Yes, there's a curtailment limit, which is better than no limit, but if it's such a long way above your predicted level of curtailment, then has it provided any benefit at all?
Hello and welcome to the Connectology podcast. Here, Road Night Taylor's influential team of elite connection specialists and their expert guests help you to better understand distribution and transmission network connections and how to acquire them faster, for less cost and at lower risk. Welcome to this episode of the Connectology podcast, where I'm talking to Pete Aston, one of the connectologists here, about SCR curtailment limits. And very quickly, the reason why we're discussing this is we're doing a webinar on understanding DNO curtailment reports, and that's being recorded tomorrow. When we just flagged that was coming up on LinkedIn, there was a really good little debate. So if we just want to name check Andy Burndies and Charles Deacon, who flagged this actually really important topic that Pete was going to do a couple of minutes on tomorrow and will do, but it's such a big topic we thought, well, let's very quickly get a full podcast recorded. So without further ado, that's what we're talking about. And Pete, hello.
Hi Hugh. Hi everyone.
And Pete, what are SCR curtailment limits?
Okay, so back in May 2022, Ofgem published their final determination on the significant code review. So that's the SCR bit. So significant code review covered two main areas, really. It covered connection charging boundary. So that's, if you're a generator, how, do you pay for the reinforcement works at the voltage you're connecting to or the voltage up? And we've done lots of webinars and various podcasts and stuff on that. So the other element was around introducing better definitions around non-firm access arrangements. And so the use of the terminology non-firm can be a bit misleading. DNOs think of non-firm in terms of the number of circuits into your site, whereas at transmission, when they talk about non-firm, they mean whether you've got availability to your connection capacity sort of all the time or not. So we're really talking here about sort of access in terms of with full availability of capacity of your site. So they tend to now talk about curtailable connections instead of non-firm connections to try and move away from some of that sort of skewed terminology. So SCR talked about connection boundary, and it talked about non-firm curtailable access. And one of the changes within SCR around curtailable connections was all around introducing a curtailment limit, so an upper level of curtailment. So that's what we're talking about today.
And who should be interested in this, by the way?
So anyone who is looking to have make applications now, so from 1st of April 2023, these changes have taken place for significant code review. So anyone who's looking to put in applications now and get offers for connections that will potentially be curtailable, and that could be generation or demand. So this is now quite broad. It could be more or less anyone applying could end up having a curtailable connection, and so these curtailment limits could apply pretty broadly. And
to what extent or proportion of connection offers might actually be impacted by this methodology?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. I think it's all about curtailment on the distribution network. And so there are lots of places on the distribution network that are full. So this could impact sort of two groups of customers. One group of customers is those who are applying for an enduring curtailable connection. So that would be where you know there's reinforcement on the network that you're going to be charged for and you don't want to pay for it or wait for it. So you're going to apply for an enduring connection. You're going to want to obviously know about this curtailment limit because it's going to impact for the duration of the site connection time frame. Other customers might have like a temporary curtailment connection prior to the DNO undertaking reinforcement that customer is not paying for. So they're quite happy to have this as a temporary solution. And for those particular customers, I guess there's less impact from this because they know that they're going to eventually come off curtailment. But it's still going to be, very important for them to know for the 5, 6, 7, 8 years, whatever it is that they have the temporary curtailable connection, what's the impact of this upper limit of curtailment on them?
Okay,
so it could be quite a lot of connections.
So for a lot of people who because of SCR coming into force on the 1st of April, they're expecting their reinforcement works to be free, and potentially they will be free in terms of they won't have to pay for them by sending money to a DNO's bank account, but the freedom that the DNOs have over the level of curtailment that they can impose uncompensated curtailment means that actually that there is likely to be a financial impact.
Yes, yeah, I think there will be. So under the temporary, even under a temporary curtailable arrangement under SCR, the customer still bears the cost of that curtailment. The point of introducing the curtailment limit was for customers to understand, the maximum exposure to that curtailment. And the general idea with SCR is above that curtailment limit, the DNO will either compensate the customer for loss of energy above the curtailment limit, or they will look to secure capacity from the market, go out to some sort of flexibility, publish some sort of requirement for flexibility service, so get market-driven prices for dealing with that, so that they're effectively paying to curtail someone else so that you, as a customer, don't get curtailed, and it's cheaper for them to curtail someone else rather than you. So I think that's the general idea, that you can be compensated, or the DNO just pulls their finger out and does the reinforcement a bit quicker, and said there's no need to curtail anyone.
Cool, good, thank you. How is Ofgem looking to implement the new curtailment limit?
So, this is where it gets a bit boring, because I'm going to start talking about DCUSA. You can go make a cup of tea. These changes are implemented through DCUSA. So DCUSA is a Distribution Connection Use of System Agreement. So basically, all the DNOs sign up to DCUSA, all the suppliers do, and some big generators do as well. The DNOs then have an obligation to implement the outworkings of the decision of Ofgem under significant code review, to implement like the legal text, if you like, that goes into DCUSA to say the DNOs have to follow these procedures in order to implement curtailment limits and all the rest of the changes. So there was a particular DCUSA change proposal, DCP 404, which was raised sort of last year for the DNOs to agree methodologies around all these sort of non-firm curtailable limits and that sort of thing. So that's the vehicle for which this is working through. So I hopefully will be able to post a link, Hugh, to
the description.
Yeah, in the description to DCP 404, which you'll be thrilled to go and read.
I can't wait.
You can't wait. But within that, there's some. It is very clear how they calculate the curtailment limits, the methodology that's going to be used to do it, which is sort of where the information I'll sort of be sharing in a bit about how they're doing it's come from, basically. So, so that's now approved and implemented. So that's what now the DNOs have to abide by.
Cool. So how does SCR curtailment limit link to a normal curtailment study?
So I think a curtailment limit under significant code review is trying to do a different thing from what you get under a normal curtailment study. Obviously, the two are linked. So the curtailment reports from the DNO trying to give what they think might be a realistic sort of outcome of curtailment. The limit is that backstop level. So there is a consistent approach between DNOs for setting curtailment limits. So like I said, it's set into the DCUSA now. So they all have to abide by a very prescriptive methodology for doing it. Whereas general curtailment studies, DNOs sort of just do what they like. It's not really published. There's a whole range of methods that are used out there, which makes then comparing curtailment across DNOs quite difficult to do.
And might this actually have I guess, a byproduct in that? Is there a chance that the 6 DNOs might actually come into line in terms of their normal day-to-day curtailment assessments? And
possibly, but I think when we come on in just a sec to talk about the actual method that this uses, I think you'll see that it's so basic that it almost doesn't even do the job it sets out to do anyway. So I think for the DNOs to then use this as a sort of common baseline to spring off for normal curtailment studies probably just it's probably too simple.
Sure. So I think we'd probably agree that it would be good if they did something, but it's going to be something far more involved than this.
Yeah, and I think the last thing to point out and how the curtailment limits differ from normal curtailment reports is that there is no transmission network assessment within the curtailment limits. So it's purely looking at the distribution network. For some connections is the bulk of your curtailment. So it's giving you a subset of the curtailment that you would see within a standard curtailment report. Right. So again, you can't necessarily read across from one to the other because they're not fully covering the same bits of network.
Yeah. Cool, and that makes sense because SGTs aren't covered under SCR. So
they're not. But the argument is that, well, from a customer point of view, it doesn't really matter whether you're being curtailed from a distribution network or a super good transformer. You as a customer don't care two hoots who owns them.
Yeah,
you're just being constrained off. So this is where this sort of just is a good example of where there is that disconnect between distribution and transmission, which there really shouldn't be because, everything, but distribution and transmission all affect you as a connected customer. But the way that it's been implemented, it just disconnects the two artificially.
Yeah. So how are the curtailment limits calculated?
So there's sort of a few basic things. The first thing that you end up doing have to do as a DNO is you get a year's worth of half hourly demand data from the network. So you look at all your BSPs, your primary substations, and so on, and you get the true demand data. So true demand data being you've stripped out any generation that was running at the time, because of that will mask the true demand on the network. So you strip the generation out, and then you've got a true sort of baseline demand set to go from. Which most of the DNOs should be doing anyway when they publish the long-term development statement. That should be demands on the network that have sort of had the generation discounted from it that was running at the time, so you get a true demand.
Yeah.
For the last few years.
It's only a year, so there are going to be a lot of irregularities.
Yeah, that's right. So
into these.
So that brings up some question marks already. As what should you be assuming for connected generation? The real fun becomes when you start moving into then generation that's not yet connected to the network. So any generation that's been accepted, for a start, you are assuming 100%. So this is all in the rules. 100% of accepted to connect generation goes into the study. So you assume none of it falls away.
Wow.
So that in and of itself, I think, is quite optimistic, especially as when you look at the ES
or pessimistic, whichever way
you're looking at it. Yeah. If you look at the ESO's change in their construction planning assumptions that they've just been rolling out this year, they're now assuming attrition rates of 66%. So they're assuming only 34% of generation.
That's across all technologies, is it?
So it's across all technologies and across big regions. So, a DNO can't make that sort of scale of attrition across, small areas of the network where there might only be 2 generators connected on a circuit that you're looking at as your limit. So you have to take allowances as to how big an area you're looking at. But you'd have thought that if you're doing an assessment across a big 1 through 2 kV network, for example, you could make some assumptions about attrition rates being more than nothing. I think there's something within that. Then if you look at in terms of attrition rates, that you also have to add in 100% of the largest 2 in-flight applications. So that's the largest 2 schemes that have had offers issued but not yet accepted. So you include the 2 largest ones, and then for all other offers that have been in-flight offers, so issued offers not yet accepted, you assume 50% of all the rest of those connect. So that's still pretty punchy in terms of
particularly if you just think
rate.
of the level of interactivity that there is now.
Yeah, and we know the level of acceptances across offers that are issued isn't anywhere near 50%.
It's about 15 or something across. Well, and it was. I think it's probably much lower now.
Yeah.
If you're liking this podcast so far, you may want to pop over to the Connectology page on Road Knight Taylor's website and sign up to the Connectology newsletter for much more know-how, insight and thought leadership in electricity network connections. The link to this is in the description. Don't miss out on any of the articles, explainers, videos, webinars and podcasts that Road Knight Taylor's connectologists share to give you an edge and help you overcome your grid frustrations.
So just looking at those sort of attrition rate figures, they will put into your analysis a lot more generation than there's realistically likely to be there, and therefore starting to already inflate your curtailment limit quite high. And so bear in mind, the higher your curtailment limit, the less chance there is on the DNO compensating you. So a high curtailment limit is good for the DNO, bad for the connecting customer. So bear that in mind. As a minimum for a battery, you could assume it's 50% load factor because it can only export 50% of the time at max if it's a standalone battery, because it has to be charging for the rest of the 50% of the time. Then for solar, it does suggest a generation profile, but this generation profile it's nothing from midnight until 10:30. From 10:30 till 5:30, it's 100%. And then from 5:30 in the evening to midnight is 0 again. So you've just got a on-off profile for solar, whereas it would be very easy to come up with even a generic solar profile to ramp up and down over a sort of standard solar curve. So it's incredibly clunky. And again, so this as well is probably the biggest factor that's going to be inflating the curtailment limits much higher than they should be.
It's extraordinary.
It is. And I know they had a short amount of time to do this. So Ofgem's decision came in May. They had to pretty much get this written by like November time. It's a short period of time. Bearing in mind that there are some DNOs that were out there, the sort of NGED UKPNs who were really quite advanced with A&M, other DNOs like ENW that hadn't really done much A&M at all. So there was a big disparity within the DNOs as to how far advanced each of them were. But even so, I think they could have done better than this. And then just sort of briefly, the last assumptions that you do, you take an assessment of your network capacity, taking into account outages and so on. And then you use 95% of your network rating to assess the curtailment against. So when you've modelled the power flow and it gets above 95%, you start curtailing your generation. So why didn't they use 100%? Because that's what the network limits are. Bearing in mind how much fat they've already built in with those other assumptions. So all of those assumptions that they're building in just are leading to curtailment limits that are going to be well in excess of an actual curtailment report. And I did hear one DNO say on a webinar seminar thing, their assessment is that these curtailment limits will be up to double what you'd get on a normal curtailment report.
Right. Okay.
I don't know if they'd done any analysis on that or just sort of thought this is bad and it's going to be a lot more.
And just to put you on the spot, a normal curtailment report, how pessimistic might they be?
I mean, some of those are pretty bad anyway. So a lot of DNOs will already be assuming under curtailment reports that, batteries are exporting 100% of the time, which is that, there's pressure for them to change, and some of them are changing to have a much more sensible profile for batteries and existing generators. But, there is generally more thought that goes into that. But, I would say existing just normal curtailment reports are quite pessimistic in and of themselves anyway.
Yeah, sure. And what are the shall I go again?
Yeah.
What are the implications of this method?
So I think that the first implication is fairly obvious, really, in the sense of the higher that curtailment limit, and we've sort of said it's going to come out high, the less risk there is of the DNO having to compensate the customer, and so the more risk there is as a customer that you're not going to get compensated. So let's say the DNO curtailment report came out as 20% curtailment, and you thought, well, I might be able to cope with that, but I'm a bit cautious around the fact that this is an open-ended curtailment. The DNO's curtailment reports generally say our estimation is 20%, but we're not going to guarantee any level of curtailment. So it could be anything, but we think it might be 20. And that's generally been problematic for developers and sort of investors. But so this sort of promise of a curtailment limit was great. So, but if a curtailment limit's going to come in at 40% compared to a normal curtailment report assessment that's 20% or something, well, is that enough of a comfort for a developer to actually, or an investor to actually put money into that project? So I think that's the big thing. Yes, there's a curtailment limit, which is better than no limit. But if it's such a long way above your predicted level of curtailment, then has it provided any benefit at all? So I think that's one question. Is because it's so high, the curtailment limits are going to be so high, has it provided anything better than what we've got at the moment? So that's one question, and I guess we'll start to see that as it comes out. I guess there's another interesting outcome in as much as some DNOs don't even produce curtailment reports at the moment. So this curtailment limit might be the only number a developer gets.
Yeah.
So, I don't know if you're up in ENW's patch and they haven't yet been issuing A&M and might still be some time off doing that, you might not get a curtailment report from them. Someone can correct me if they're actually doing them now, but it's just as an example. But what if you only see that curtailment limit? You've got to know that that's a very, very, very pessimistic number compared to what you might get from a normal report. I just think that's the main thing, really. That there's something else around the type of networks that you can apply this to. So you can only really apply spreadsheet-based curtailment assessments on very, very simple networks. So a radial network is just one circuit that goes out from a substation to another substation and doesn't interconnect with anything else. It's quite easy to calculate curtailment like that. When you've got meshed networks or ring networks, you basically can't use spreadsheets. And I'd say a good third of the country has got ringed or meshed networks.
Wow.
So how you apply this spreadsheet-based approach to anything that's more complicated than a radial network there's a massive question to it. In the guidance in DCP 404, it just says something like the DNO needs to apply a factor or something vague and woolly like that to just say, well, we don't really know how to do this, but give it your best shot.
Just to account for the complexity on that part of the network.
That's right, because if you're poking power at one circuit, it can go 2 or 3 or 4 ways on a mesh network, whereas on a radial network, it's just can only go one way, so it's really easy to make the assessment. So and the way the DNOs deal with complicated mesh networks is they a lot of them outsource it to some providers who run complicated assessments that can take computationally days to run. So that's the sort of level of computer programming, computer power you need to solve and produce curtailment reports for complicated networks. So yeah, you can't just do it in a spreadsheet.
No, but they're going to. Good. And so it's not an ideal situation, except if you happen to be a DNO, in which case it's.
I think the DNOs probably come out fairly good on this, because the likelihood of any of these customers in real life reaching these curtailment limits, I think, is virtually nothing.
Am I right in thinking that reduces the pressure on the DNO to get reinforcement work? So if it's
Absolutely.
an interim flexible arrangement, it reduces the pressure on them to carry out the
It does, but in addition to this curtailment limit, there should be, for these interim curtailment schemes, there will be curtailment end date. So once you've reached that curtailment end date, you will not be expected to fund any curtailment. So once you've reached that date, the DNO has to cover, either not curtail you or pay you to be curtailed. So that's. Yeah, so the two things work together.
And how is that end date calculated, or is that an entire?
I think that's another podcast, because I'd have to get my head around how they're actually doing it. I'd have to go and read the other bit of DCP 404 to work that bit out. But yeah, it is going to be linked to how long the DNO thinks that reinforcement's going to take. So again, I think the end limit's going to be set in the favour of the DNO for them to be allowed to deliver what could be quite complicated reinforcement schemes.
Yeah, cool.
And I think it's also worth saying that just as a more general point, we've been talking around curtailment limits. It can be that other constraints on your connection are far more significant than curtailment anyway. So could be the outage risk and that sort of thing. Intertrips take you off for a lot longer than curtailment would anyway.
Yeah, there does seem to be and it's healthy that developers and investors are looking at curtailment, but it's something that I must say I get from you and Philip an awful lot, is that actually it can be just relatively insignificant compared to the outage risk. And I think you're working on a project at the moment which is connected and has got something like 6 million quid's worth of outage risk associated with it in a single year, and that's a 132 kV connected project. There are so many 132 kV connected projects that have got accepted offers, and with all of the connections, the number of outages that there are going to be in order to enable these projects to connect, I imagine there's going to be a rash of outage that will make this sort of pale into insignificance. Would that be about right?
I think so. You can easily on the 132 network experience weeks or months worth of outages because of just tower painting or changing towers or changing various bits of kit. 132 kV outage risk is quite significant. And you really need to look at that in your connection offers because it's a massive problem. You want to have the conversation before you connect because it's a lot easier to sort it out before you've connected than once you've connected and you realise each year you're going to be off for 2 months or something.
Yeah, sounds frightening. So what can our audience here do about this, the methodology that we've just discussed around that curtailment limit?
So I think the first thing is just be aware of what the number is. It's just a number that's based on massive amounts of unrealistic assumptions. So I wouldn't pay too much close attention to the number. But I think what developers would really want to do is to see those curtailment limits come down. And the way that you'd have to do that is to look to change the rules, because a DNO is going to say, I have applied this methodology correctly. This is your number. That's tough. You can't go and change it. So what you have to do is go and change the methodology. So the good thing is you can look to make changes to DCUSA. So if you happen to be a signatory to DCUSA, you can suggest modifications.
And who are those signatories?
Well, So some of the main signatories are the DNOs. So I suspect that they're not going to be willingly looking to change the methodology to reduce the level of these curtailment limits. So yeah, you only need one party to submit a change mod proposal, and that would then convene a working group for them to then thrash out what this looks like. And I think that some of the key things that you'd want to look at are like getting suitable generation profiles. So these aren't things that are going to be difficult to implement. So it's like, well, you could just have a solar profile that actually looked like a solar profile, not as, not binary. Building in some better attrition rates, reducing them from assuming 100% of things are going ahead to a bit less. Raise those asset assessment limits from 95% up to 98% or 100%. So I think there's a few things that you could do in there to suggest improvements to the methodology that could make quite a bit of difference.
Yeah, cool. And have we exhausted the subject?
I think pretty much. I'm sure there'll be more that we'll say on it once we start seeing some actual curtailment limits coming out. Because I think we'd want to be having the conversations with the DNO about, well, have you applied that methodology correctly? Can we see your working, please? Because there is a spreadsheet that's provided with the DCP 404. So I guess the DNO could just produce that spreadsheet for you, and you could say, well, I want to look through it, please. I want to check that you've got this set correctly. So I don't think there's any harm in actually challenging these, but we're yet to see them issued yet because we're not yet 3 months from the 1st of April.
Yeah, of course, the offers aren't yet coming out, and I guess even so, there is still the problem that the data that they're modelling, so that the demand data and generation data isn't necessarily completely bulletproof across all the networks. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's right. There's always data issues. A big part of this is getting the data right. And a lot of this data won't be published. So not every DNO or not many DNOs publish their half-hourly demand data, for example. So you don't necessarily have all the information for you to go back and, do this calculation for yourself. So in certain circumstances, it wouldn't necessarily be inappropriate to go and ask the DNOs, well, give me the same data that you've got. I want to turn the handle on this myself.
Which I think should be absolutely part of the course. I think that data, every time a coconut, whether or not it's under SCR or not, that you should be able to get that data. And
absolutely. And this is, so Ofgem have sort of got this open letter going at the moment, I think, where you can reply to, although the replies close on the 16th of June.
I think you've written our reply.
I have written our reply, but by the time this podcast goes out, the closing date will have passed for the 16th of June. But nevertheless, that gives an opportunity for developers to sort of say to Ofgem, well, this is the sort of thing we want from the DNOs. We need transparency of data so that we can see if we can come up with the same conclusion based on the same methodology.
Yeah. And it would be good to have all of those assumptions as well as the data.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
So that everybody, and obviously it would be great if all the DNOs used exactly the same assumptions.
I mean, a good thing with the curtailment limits assessment is that they should all be using the same assumptions because they're codified. It's just, the fact is they're rubbish, but they should all be using the same assumptions.
Yeah. Well, hopefully, I mean, fingers crossed that there is going to be a decuser change modification.
Well, if you're a generator listening and you are a party to decuser, and you want to change this,
well, it'd be a shame if somebody, you're putting yourself forward for.
Well, maybe not. I don't know. I have to ask you, Hugh.
Cool, good. Pete, thank you very much. I think we have now exhausted that topic. That was great. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow on a webinar.
Indeed.
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye then. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Connectology podcast. If you found it helpful, please share it with any of your colleagues or connections you think may be interested. And please do subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your content. You can find out more about our services at roadnighttaylor.co.uk. link in the description, where you can also sign up to our free Connectology newsletter for more news and thought leadership in network connections. If, during this podcast, you found yourself wondering what it would be like to have a Road Knight Taylor connectologist in your life, please do email laura@roadknighttaylor.co.uk to find out how their game-changing skills and insight can change the game for you too.